We continue now at the top of Daf Mem Tes Amud Aleph in Meseches Avodah Zarah. This is Avodah Zarah Daf 49a. On the previous Amud, the Gemara said that according to Rabbi Yossi from our Mishnah, Zev Zeh Gorim is Aser. The case in our Mishnah was that a person, according to Rabbi Yossi, is not supposed to plant vegetables under an Asherah tree, even in the rainy season, because the leaves will fall from the Asherah tree and they'll fertilize the ground. And even though that's only part of the nutrients of the vegetables, which is Zev Zeh Gorim, in other words, you have from the Asherah tree some fertilization and from the nutrients of the ground itself some fertilization, but still it is prohibited for that reason. That's what Rabbi Yossi said in the Mishnah, and again the Gemara said in the previous Amud that Rabbi Yossi seems to hold Zev Zeh Gorim is Aser. And the Gemara is in the middle of asking from Arla. The Brisa by Arla says that you're allowed, that let's say somebody plants an Arla nut, we'll see in a moment the full case, so it's going to be mutter according to Rabbi Yossi, and again that also is a case of Zev Zeh Gorim, and that's the question of the Gemara. The Gemara now continues with the Brisa that Rabbi Yossi says She'im Nata, that if he plants, let's say he plants the Arla nut, v'hivrich v'hirkiv, hivrich means that you take the branch and you sink it into the ground to create a new tree, hirkiv means you graft, so in these cases mutter, it is mutter. And Rashi explains v'hivrich v'hirkiv, im hivrich o hirkiv yichor shal Arla, let's say a person, again he sinks the branch or he grafts a branch of Arla bi'ilon zakin onto an old tree, mutarim peirosein miyad, those fruits are mutter immediately. Afal bishalom molo lahen shnei Arla, even though the years of Arla have not completed, the Zev Zeh Gorim mutter, that's the case of Zev Zeh Gorim, you have coming from the Arla tree, but also coming from the older tree, and that's mutter. We say this in general, Yalda shesivcha b'zekena b'tela. We say that if you have a Yalda, again a younger tree together with an older tree, that's batla, that is going to be nullified. That's how Rashi first explains. Lashon Acher, another way of understanding this, Imnato ha'egos shal Arla. Let's say he plants the nut of the Arla tree, shu iser hana, which is aser b'hana, u'lechashayigdal v'nasa netiya, and then when it gets larger and it becomes a sapling, hivricha v'hirkiva bi'ilon deheter, he goes ahead and he either again sinks the branch or he grafts it to a tree that's mutter. So mutter, it's going to be mutter. The osan peiros shatoin acharzman boy nami al yedei ha'ilon shel heter, because any fruits that come later is Zev Zeh Gorim, they're also coming through the mutter tree. Rashi notes v'kashli now, and this second explanation is a little difficult. Below hivrich u'below hirkiv nami iko Zev Zeh Gorim. You don't even need to have that he's sinking the branch into the ground or he's grafting. It's still Zev Zeh Gorim, just the act of planting the nut in the ground, because egos de ister v'karka de heter. You have the nut, which is ister, and the nutrients from the ground, that's also heter. So even without hivrich v'hirkiv, you still have a situation of Zev Zeh Gorim, says Rashi. But in any case, again, the Gemara is asking that over here it seems that Rabbi Yossi holds Zev Zeh Gorim is mutter, and the Gemara continues and says, now if you're going to say, Shani le Rabbi Yossi ben Shari Isurim la'avodas kochavim, maybe Rabbi Yossi makes a distinction between other Isurim, let's say like Arla, there he'll be lenient, Zev Zeh Gorim is mutter, but Avodah Zara, like in our Mishnah, so there he's going to be strict by Zev Zeh Gorim, and he's going to say that it is Aser. Rashi explains, Shani le Rabbi Yossi ben avodas kochavim l'shari Isurim, da'afa gav de v'shari Isurim, Zev Zeh Gorim mutter, even though by other Isurim, like Arla, Zev Zeh Gorim is mutter, Svir le'hacha Aser, still he holds over here that it is Aser. Maybe you'll say that, but Umishani, does he really make that distinction? V'atanya, but we learned in a brayso, Sadash and his davla bezevel avodas kochavim. Let's say you have a field and it was fertilized with the manure of Avoda Zara. V'chein parish and his fatma bekarshine avodas kochavim. Let's say you have a cow that was fattened by the vetch of Avoda Zara. So clearly this is talking about a situation of Avoda Zara. Tani chad, in one brayso it says Sada tizra para tishachet. It says that the field, it should be planted and the cow can be slaughtered, meaning to say that it's mutter. In other words, it seems to be saying Zev Zeh Gorim is mutter. V'tanyu idach, and then we have another brayso that says Sadeh Tavor, the field you have to let it lay fallow. Upara Tirza, you have to let the cow thin out. You can't let it stay fattened like that and benefit from that. And so it seems to be there that the second brayso is saying Zev Zeh Gorim is Asur, and this is a case of Avodah Zara. And the Gemara says, My lav ha Rabbi Yossi v'ha. Is it not that in one case we're talking according to Rabbi Yossi, in one case we're talking according to the Rabbanan? And Rashi explains, Bekarshine avodas kochavim shall tikroves avodas kochavim. Let's say the vetch was an offering of Avodah Zara, osha of them, or maybe the vetch itself was served. Tavor, so you let it lay fallow. Achatichla mimena kol shvach hazevel. You have to let Any benefit that came from the manure, you have to let that go away. Again, you have to let it lay fallow, you don't plant it. And here's the tekachesh, you let the cow weaken, you let it thin out. And so the Gemara says, my lav is it not? Hadukatani sadat tizra, the one that says that the field can be planted, meaning to say that zev is zagorim is mutter, and this is by Avoda Zara. That's Rabbi Yossi, isn't that Rabbi Yossi? The shaminan le damar gabe orla, because we just said above that he says by orla zev is zagorim mutter, that zev is zagorim is mutter, and he says that he extends that to Avoda Zara as well. Hachanami tizra, here also you planted vazram gedelam al yedei zevel the isra v'karka deheter, and again whatever grows is growing through the manure which was asur, but also the land which was mutter. Again, it's a situation of zev is zagorim. To lo shani le ben avodas kocham l'shar isurim, and he does not make a distinction between Avoda Zara and other isurim. And if you interpret in that fashion, v'kasha masnisa, now you have a difficulty from our Mishnah, because again in our Mishnah Rabbi Yossi says that it's problematic to plant vegetables under the Asherah tree because you're going to have fertilization from the leaves that drop, and that's zev is zagorim. There it seems to be zev is zagorim is asur. Upara tishchit v'tochal, and the cow can be slaughtered and eaten. Shafi isa gedela kodem l'chein al yidei shar achilos, because of course the cow eats other things besides this vetch of Avoda Zara, so it's the case also of zev is zagorim. And Rashi continues, V'hada katani, and that which the brisa which said Sada Tavar, that you let the field lay fallow. Rabbanani, that's going to be the Rabbanan, the Amri Afi Nasis Zevel. That's the Rabbanan who say in terms of grinding up Avodah Zarah and you throw it into the wind. The Rabbanan there were strict. They said it's problematic because it's going to end up being fertilizer. That also is a situation of Zev Zagorim, and there the Rabbanan seem to be strict, and that's the brisa over here as well, where we're letting the field lay fallow. V'ha Deshari Masnisa. Now you might ask, what about our Mishnah? Because in our Mishnah the Rabbanan actually permit to plant the vegetables under the Asherah tree. It says Zor and Tachteh Yerakos, you're allowed to plant the vegetables under. So Hashaninale, that we actually answered. We gave a different answer for our Mishnah on the previous Amud. We said Masha Mashbiach B'nevoya Pogim B'tzel, because whatever gain you get from the fertilization, you actually lose from the shade, because the shade is a negative benefit, and so therefore the Rabbanan in our Mishnah, they pose no problem. And the Gemara continues and says, Lo, no, that's not how to interpret these two brisas, that one is Rabbi Yossi, who says Zev Zagorim is mutter, and one's the Rabbanan, that they say Zev Zagorim is asur. Rather, Ha Rabbi Eliezer, V'ha Rabbanan. Rather, one brisa is Rabbi Eliezer, and the other is the Rabbanan. And Rashi explains, Ha Rabbi Eliezer, V'ha Rabbanan, one is Rabbi Eliezer, and one is the Rabbanan. Avol Rabbi Yossi, according to this answer, the Gemara is suggesting that according to Rabbi Yossi, Ba'avodas kochavim Zev Zagorim asur. By Avodah Zara, Zev Zagorim is asur. In other words, he only says by Orla, Zev Zagorim is mutter, but he's actually strict when it comes to Avodah Zara, Svir Le, Kedektani Masis, and that's what he holds, just like it says in our Mishnah again, that it's problematic to plant the vegetables under the Asherah tree, because it's a situation where the leaves are going to fertilize those vegetables. Zev Zagorim is asur by Avodah Zara. Now, V'imisham Shochek V'zor, now maybe you'll ask, well, what about that Rabbi Yossi permits you to grind up Avodah Zara and throw it into the wind? Shouldn't that be problematic because it becomes fertilizer, and we would say Zev Zagorim is asur? So that also, Hashaninan Leila'el, we offered an answer to that earlier in the previous Amud. We already gave an answer for that the idea is over there, that it's a kind of bittul, a kind of nullification. V'imisham Arla, and if you're going to say, well, we have a question from Arla, where Zev Zagorim seems to be mutter, Shani Le, Ben Avodas Kocham, L'shar Yisurin, and again we make a distinction between Avodah Zara and other Yisurin, like we just said. And the Gemara continues, Hey Rabbi Eliezer v'Rabbanan, where do we find this machlokis, Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan, that we're saying is a machlokis, whether Zev Zagorim is asur or mutter? Ilaim Rabbi Eliezer v'Rabbanan de Saor, if you're going to say it's the machlokis between Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan by sourdough, Saor is a kind of leaven. The Tanan, as we learned in a Mishnah, this is a Mishnah in Orla, Saor shel chulin v'shel truma, let's say Saor of chulin and Saor of truma, they shenaflu l'socha isa, they fell into dough, and they caused the dough to rise. Lo bazeh katei l'chametz, now there wasn't enough in this one to cause it to rise, and there wasn't enough in the other one to cause it, meaning you didn't have enough Saor of chulin to cause it to ferment, and you didn't have enough of the Saor of truma to cause it to ferment on its own. However, however combined, the two Saors combined, they did cause it to rise to become chametz. And so in this case, it's a machlokas whether it has the status of truma or not. Rabbi Eliezer says, Achar acharon ani bo, I go by whatever fell in last, whichever Saor fell in last, that's the one that we're going to say is the true cause, and it's going to take on that status. If the Saor of Truma fell in last, for example, it will be Truma. The Chachamim say, Bein shenafal isra lechatchila, whether the prohibited one fell in first, uvein shenafal isra levasof, or whether the prohibited one fell in last, Eino asra sheyehei bo kedei lechametz, it's not forbidden unless the forbidden one had enough to cause it to become chametz. And so again, the idea over here, according to the Chachamim, seems to be that Zev Zegorim is mutter, and the Gemara is going to suggest in a moment that Rabbi Eliezer holds Zev Zegorim is asur. As the Gemara continues, V'yamar Abaye, and Abaye says, Lo shanu ela shakadam v'silek eser isser. When Rabbi Eliezer said that we follow the last one, that's only if he first removed the prohibited one. Meaning to say, let's say the Seor of Truma fell in first. He removed that, and then the Seor of Chulin fell in, so then Rabbi Eliezer says, Achar Achron Aniba, and that we can be lenient. Avalo Kadam V'silek Eser, but let's say the Seor of Truma fell in first, it was not removed, he didn't go ahead and remove it, and then the Seor of Chulin fell in, and they're both essentially Zev Zegorem, so then Aser, so then Rabbi Eliezer would say Aser, that's how Abaye explains Rabbi Eliezer, and if you explain Rabbi Eliezer in that fashion, then Rabbi Eliezer is saying Zev Zegorem is Aser. But the Gemara says, Umimai the time of Rabbi Eliezer b'di Abaye. How do you know that Rabbi Eliezer's reasoning really follows Abaye? How do you know Abaye is correct in his explanation of Rabbi Eliezer? Dilma time of Rabbi Eliezer, maybe really the reason of Rabbi Eliezer is Mishum da'achar achron aniba. It really is exactly what he said, that whichever one falls in last, we say that's the one that's the true cause. Igomer b'isura asura. If it concludes with the one that is asur, it's asur. V'igomer b'heter, and if it concludes with the one that's heter, then it's mutar, and then they're mutar. Bein salke uvein lo salke. It doesn't matter if it was removed. It doesn't matter if it was not removed. And really, the true reason of Rabbi Eliezer perhaps has nothing to do with Zev Zegorim. It just has to do with the idea of Achar Achron Aniba. And Rashi explains, again, Abaye said, Avolim lo kadam v'silek es isser, but if he didn't go ahead and remove the isser, so then it's asr, even though the last one to fall in was the Seor shel Chulin. She'af al pi shenafal heter levasof. Abaye is saying, according to Rabbi Eliezer, even though the heter fell in at the end, asr is going to be forbidden. The Zev Zegorim asr, because Rabbi Eliezer holds Zev Zegorim is asr. Well, the Rabbanon Zev Zegorim mutter, and according to the Rabbanon, Zev Zegorim is mutter. But then the Gemara says, who says that Abaye is correct? Mishum da'achar achron aniba. Maybe the real reason is because we follow the last one, to Kasavar, because he holds Gamru be'isr asr, if it finishes with isr, it's asr. Gamru be'heter mutter, if it finishes with heter, it's mutter. Aval heicha denaflu be'basachas, but let's say, for example, they both fall at the same time. Liolam ka'amar loch, zev zegorim mutter svirole. Maybe there we'll say that he really does hold zev zegorim is mutter. And so the Gemara continues, Ela rather Rabbi Eliezer v'Rabbanan de'etzim. Where do we find that Rabbi Eliezer holds that Zev is Zegorim is Aser? It's by the machlokus between Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan by the wood, and this is in a Mishnah coming up. Titnan, as we learned in a Mishnah coming up, not al heimeno eitzim, if a person takes from an Asherah tree wood, Asura b'hana, it's prohibited to get any benefit from the wood of an Asherah tree. Hisik boas hatanur, let's say he uses this wood in order to light the oven. Chadash, so if it's a new oven, yutatz, it has to be destroyed. Yashan, if it's an old oven, yutzan, then it's cooled off. Afa boes apas, if he uses this wood in order to bake bread, asura bahana, then it is forbidden bahana. And as we're going to see in Rashi in a moment, this is a case of zev zegorim, and we're saying it's forbidden. And the Mishnah says further, nisarva ba'acherim, let's say this bread gets mixed up with other bread, kulan asuros bahana, so then all of them are asur bahana, you can't get benefit from any of the bread. Rabbi Eliezer says you could be a little more lenient when it gets mixed up. Yolech hana liyam hamelach, you can just take the equivalent of the benefit and just throw that in the yam hamelach. You don't have to say that all of that bread is forbidden. Amrulo, they said to Rabbi Eliezer, ein pidyon la'avodas kol chavim, there's no such thing as redemption when it comes to Avoda Zara, so we cannot use this leniency. And in any case, we see in this Mishnah that Rabbi Eliezer holds zev zegorim is asr. And the Gemara continues, Rabbanan depligi oled Rabbi Eliezer. Now, where do we find that the Rabbanan argue on Rabbi Eliezer and they hold zev zegorim mutter? Manin, which Rabbanan are the ones that are lenient. Ilema Rabbanan de'etzim, if you're going to say it's the Rabbanan in the Mishnah just quoted above by the wood of an Asherah tree, achmure mechamri, actually the Rabbanan are more strict than Rabbi Eliezer, because in the case where everything gets mixed up, Rabbi Eliezer says yolech hanol yam hamelach, and the Rabbanan say kulan asuro, so the Rabbanan are certainly also saying zev zegorim is asur. And so the Gemara instead says, Elareh, the Rabbanan disor, it's the Rabbanan of the sourdough Mishnah in Orla that we just quoted above. There, as we explained in that Mishnah, the Rabbanan holds Zev Zegorim is mutter in that case. But the Gemara says, Amor de Shamatl hu the Rabbanan de Mekili b'Seor. We can say that the Rabbanan, we understand that the Rabbanan are lenient. By the case of Seor, again, that was the case of the Seor and the Truma, Zev Zegorim. There, the Rabbanan were lenient, and they say Zev Zegorim is mutter. But by avodas kochavim mi mekili, but by Avoda Zara do we find that the Rabbanan are lenient, and so therefore, even if you're going to say you have a source that the Rabbanan are lenient, but it's only by other isurim. And so the Gemara instead says, Ella, rather go back to what we said before, Liolam ha Rabbi Yossi v'ha-Rabbanan. Really, we're going to say that there's a machlokes between Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanan in terms of zev zagorim, and Rabbi Yossi is the one that says zev zagorim is mutter. The Rabbanan are the ones that say that zev zagorim is aser. And so then the question is, what's going on in our Mishnah? And the Gemara explains, Rabbi Yossi ledivreim de Rabbanan, Amar lehu. Rabbi Yossi is just speaking according to the Rabbanan, meaning as follows. Here's what Rabbi Yossi is saying. Lididi, according to me, zev zagorim mutter. In the case of zev zagorim, it's mutter, meaning according to me, really it is no problem to plant these vegetables under the Asherah tree. The fact that some of the leaves are going to fall and cause a fertilization, it's not a problem because zev zagorim is mutter. But Rabbi Yossi says to the Rabbanan, lidid chu, but according to you, the amrisu zev zagorim aser, you say zev zagorim is aser. Odu li miya asaf yirakos b'mos hagashamim. You should admit to me by yirakos b'mos hagashamim that it should be problematic because zev zagorim is aser. And the Gemara says v'Rabbanan, and what do the Rabbanan respond to Rabbi Yossi? Kido Amar Rav Mori breder Rav Kahana, like Rav Mori, the son of Rav Kahana, said on the previous Amud that even though there is some benefit of the fertilization, but in the amount of benefit there's also a loss because the shade actually is bad for the vegetable. So whatever there is gained, there ends up being lost anyhow, and therefore it is not a problem. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says, halacha ka Rabbi Yossi. The halacha is like Rabbi Yossi. And Rashi explains, Natal heimeno eitzim minhu asherah. Again, someone takes wood from an asherah tree, masnisini, that's a Mishnah coming up. Chadash yutat, so he uses that wood by a new oven. You have to destroy that oven. Sharei nasev v'huchzak meisuri hana, because if it's a new oven, it actually becomes strengthened. It becomes a usable oven through that wood, through that isuri hana, so it has to be destroyed. Yashan, if it's an old oven, shekvar huchzak, it's already strong. Vein haseko lechazko elefos, there you're only lighting the oven, not in order to strengthen the oven, but in order to actually bake. So yutzan, so just cool it off. Shalo yefu behezek, meaning don't bake anything with this fire. V'nimtza shalo nene, so it's going to come out. You didn't get any benefit. Afes hapas. Now, if he did bake bread with this wood, bein b'chodash shetzinena, whether it's a new one that was cooled off, v'chazer v'heseko ba'atzei, then he goes and lights it with wood that's mutter. Bein b'yashan, or if it's an old oven, b'hesek shalatzei iser, with the wood, with the fire again of this wood of iser, havale b'tarvayu zev zagorim. In both situations, the bread is going to be a zev zagorim. Shapas shenefes bo b'chodash b'hesek sheni ba al yedei gorem de iser, because again the bread that was baked, let's say it was baked in the new oven and in the second fire, so that's coming through the cause of the Isser. The Isser is involved, because that caused the oven to be usable, to be strong. V'gorim heter the hayasik, but there's also a heter that's causing the bread to be baked with the second fire. V'katani hapas asur, and what is it saying? It's saying again that the bread is asur, it's forbidden. Rabbi Eliezer, it's forbidden according to Rabbi Eliezer. Unless you take the value of that wood of Isser and you bring that to the Yam HaMelech, to the Dead Sea. Alma zev zagorim aser. The point over here is you see that zev zagorim is aser with regards to the bread. And then the Gemara said, El Rabbanon de Seor. The Gemara wanted to identify the Rabbanon who say that Zev Zagorim is mutter. It can't be the Rabbanon in the Mishnah coming up by the wood of the Asherah, because they're even stricter than Rabbi Eliezer. So instead the Gemara said it's the Rabbanon by the Seor. That's the Seor of Chulin and Truma in the Mishnah and Orla. Pligi Elave v'Amri, because they argue over there and they say Zev Zagorim mutter. They say it's that Zev Zagorim is mutter over there. The Katani Afilo Nafal Isser Besof. So they say even if the Isser falls at the end, the Kol Shekei Naflu Bebasachas, and for sure if they fall at the same time, mutter, it's permitted actually be'isr levado kadei lachametz, unless you have the isr alone is able to ferment. And then the Gemara went on to say that even the Rabbanan, if they are lenient, it's by Shari Surim, but not necessarily by Avoda Zara. And so then the Gemara went back and said, really, it is a machlokes between Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanan. Elaliolam hadakatani sada tizra. Rather, that which says that the field is allowed to be planted, we're lenient when it comes to Avoda Zara. Rabbi Yossi, it's actually Rabbi Yossi, the Shamina legabe Orla damar mutter. We see by Orla that he says Zev Zagorim is mutter. The gabe Avodas Kochavim, we see that also by Avoda Zara. The kamar shochek v'zora l'ruach. Again, he says you can grind up the Avoda Zara and throw it in the wind. Velo shani ben avodas kocham l'shar isurin. And now the Gemara is saying that Rabbi Yossi does not make any distinction between Avodah Zarah and other isurin. He is lenient. V'tayim alav kidushanin and mishum de'azal li'ibudhu. And the reason is not like we said earlier, that in the case of grinding up the Avodah Zarah, it's all going to destruction and essentially it's nullified. U'dekashalach Rabbi Yossi demasnisin. So now that brings us to our Mishnah. We have a difficulty with Rabbi Yossi in our Mishnah because again, Rabbi Yossi in the Mishnah seems to say it's problematic to plant the vegetables under the Asherah tree, which would seem to be a case of zev zagorim because it's going to be fertilized by the leaves of the Asherah tree. The nevaya, again, the case of the fertilization of the leaves. L'divrayim the rabbanon kamar lu. He actually was just talking according to the rabbanon, meaning lididchu. He was saying according to you. The koamrizu zev zagorim aser, that you say zev zagorim is aser. The koamri avalo b'yamos hachamim mipnei shatzel yafel hen. You say that in the summer you're not allowed to plant vegetables under the Asherah tree because the shade is good for the vegetables. Odu li nami b'mos hagashamim. You should say that too. Admit by the rainy season also. The economy gorim the nevaya. There also you have the fact that the leaves are causing fertilization. For Rabbanan Amri leka gorim de isser de mashesh bichu b'nevaya pagmo b'tzel. But the Rabbanan respond that's not considered a gorim of isser because whatever improvement there is from the fertilization, you actually lose out by the shade in the rainy season. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. How ginsa dis daval bezivla davodas kochavim. There was a garden that was fertilized with manure of Avoda Zara. Shalach Rav Amram kamed Rav Yosef. Rav Amram sent the question before Rav Yosef. Amar Lei said to him, Hachi Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. This is what Rav Yehuda said. That Shmuel said, Halachik Rav Yossi. The halach is like Rav Yossi, that zev is a gorm is mutter, and we can be lenient. And Rashi explains, "Bezevel avodas kochavim, the manure of Avoda Zara, sheba midam porim va'agolim hanishchotim la'avodas kochavim." It came from the blood of these cows and calves that were slaughtered for Avoda Zara. The tekrovas avodas kochavim, those are offerings of Avoda Zara. Va'asurin bahana, and they're forbidden in benefit. Avol Omar zevel zel avodas kochavim. Let's say somebody would say this manure is for Avoda Zara, that ain't oneser. That actually would not be forbidden. Kedetani's we learned in a brisa, ain't hektish la'avodas kochavim. There's no concept of consecration when it comes to Avoda Zara. And halacha Rabbi Yossi, again the halacha is like Rabbi Yossi, that zev is agorim mutter, that zev is agorim is mutter, and that's true even by Avoda Zara according to Rabbi Yossi. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Memtes Amud Beis.